So good afternoon and welcome. And thank you for joining us today for Reflections of a Chief Financial Officer, Lessons Learned from the Pandemic and Managing Resources in its Aftermath. As a reminder, ASL interpreters are available to pin in addition to closed captioning, which is available through the menu at Zoom. This presentation you are reviewing has been prepared by and is the property of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Reproduction is expressly prohibited without prior written consent from MSCHE. For permission requests, please email MSCHE at thepresident@msche.org. Always seek the advice of your institutional assigned vice president liaison with any questions specific to your institution. This presentation is not intended as a substitute for professional advice from Middle States and is used to not guarantee any specific accreditation outcome. As you can see on the next slide, as a reminder, you can submit questions in the Q&A function. And so I'd like to welcome you and do some introductions here. You know, as we think about this topic, the pandemic exposed the financial vulnerability of higher education, and as such, institutions' leaders had to pivot and innovate to respond to this impact. The aftermath of the pandemic will continue to provide both challenges and opportunities for higher education. And today we are honored to have three of your MSCHE colleagues on lessons learned and moving forward. I would now like to ask Bronte, Lloyd, and Anne-Marie to introduce themselves. Bronte?
My pleasure, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bronte Burley Jones. I have the honor and distinction of serving as the CFO, Vice President, and Treasurer at American University, which also happens to be my alma mater. I returned there 18 months ago, serving previously at Dickinson College and St. John's College. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
And we'll turn it to Lloyd.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lloyd Ricketts. Similar to Bronte, I have the pleasure of serving as a Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Wilmington University. I'm also serving as a commissioner and the treasurer of the commission. Prior to my tenure here at Wilmington University, I spent a few decades at the College of New Jersey in the capacity of vice president and treasurer. And thank you all for joining us today.
Anne-Marie.
Hi, all. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Anne-Marie Scheidegger. I'm the Vice President of Administrative Services at SUNY Adirondack. It's a medium-sized community college in upstate New York. We serve about 6,000 students total. Our budget is about $35 million. I've been doing this for a little over a decade and also spent a few years at a private institution in New York. And I'm also currently serving as the president of the New York State Community College Business Officers Association, which is the group of community college business officers in our state.
Great. And thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this conversation and reflections. I know that this is both Bronte and Lloyd's second time around and sharing some thoughts, and we are glad that Anne-Marie is joining us too from New York to talk about some of the challenges that they're all seeing and how they've actually came back from the pandemic. So as we see on the next slide, there's three areas that we're going to focus on today in this conversation. First is going to be lessons learned post-COVID, other thoughts about thinking differently about budgets and resource allocation, and then kind of the final thoughts of where do we go from here. And so as we know, as we transition here to the next slide, our first kind of conversation of what we want to kind of look at is what are some lessons learned post-COVID for institutions. And in order to help facilitate this and getting to the heart of the lessons learned, I'm going to pose the first question that's on the next slide to our panelists. And as you can see here, we're going to rotate around here so that we're not always going to be picking on Bronte or Lloyd or Anne Marie. We're going to share the wealth. And so I'd like to ask Bronte to start us off with this question. You know, as a CFO, how did you approach revenue diversification during this time of the pandemic and the challenges in higher education?
Certainly, Steve. I'm going to just start off by saying I'm going to flavor some of my answers with a little of Dickinson and a little of American, because I was at Dickinson when we were first learning to kind of tread through the COVID. But since then, being an American. And as you might imagine, location makes a difference in how they were able to respond. Dickinson is a small liberal arts institution in central Pennsylvania, compared with 2,300 students, compared to American University in the heart of Washington, D.C., with 14,000 students. So at AU, as fate would have it, the university was in the middle of its second year of the strategic plan. And one of the priorities in the plan, Change Makers for a Changing World, was revenue diversification. So they were kind of out of the gate with that and already starting to make some strides there. Key among the priorities were doubling our indirect cost rate. So making the decision previously to hire a new vice provost for research to bring in additional research dollars for the university, that was well underway. Clearly, with any campaign, which we have just begun as well, looking for opportunities to grow the endowment in our annual fund. At AU, our endowment contributes less than 5% to the operating budget. So I'm putting a real focus on additional dollars coming in, particularly for financial aid for our chairs and for research kind of activities. One of the things that was really important during the period at AU was growing our lifelong learning capabilities. So we were doing that and gearing up for that before COVID. And then during that period, clearly all of us were focused for some time on hybrid and those opportunities. But because we had started to lay the groundwork for that, many opportunities for us to expand our lifelong learning in terms of some additional graduate programs, but also in the form of certifications, credentials, and other programs on the campus. And as you might imagine, in Washington, D.C., kind of fertile ground for lots of additional students, which was a little different than at Dickinson. We had begun looking at graduate programs there, working in partnership with the Army War College, but location matters, right? Because again, at AU, looking at additional rental and leasing income opportunities, because we have several commercial buildings in key locations in the city, on streets that everybody knows about, Connecticut Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue. So lots of opportunities to monetize space there. Again, slightly different than the opportunities that we had at Dickinson, but we were looking at how do we repurpose space and partner with local partners. So a combination of things in terms of additional tuition revenue, in terms of long-term, lifelong learning, rental income, growing our conference revenue. So were a few of the things that were on the radar screen and implemented at both universities.
Great, thank you. Lloyd, how about from your perspective and your background?
Sure. So I'll similar to Bronte, I'll touch on a little bit on TCNJ and then also Wilmington. So as you know, the College of New Jersey is a public institution, so there's state support that comes along with the tuition and fees, primarily undergrad, traditional undergrad. So we had a year-long strategic planning process. And frankly, the impetus for that was talking about financial sustainability. How do we diversify the revenue stream rather than relying on the traditional, age students? We have very little capacity in terms of accepting transfer students, and the planning process, which was pretty robust and campus-wide, a lot of involvement of everyone, kind of, come to the conclusion that business as usual is not sustainable. We have to diversify the student population. So there was a push to do some articulation agreement with various community colleges to try and attract more transfer students. At the same time, as part of the enrollment management strategy, going after what we consider provisional students. These are students coming in the fall. They're not quote unquote matriculated as a full-time student. They take, reduced course load. And then if they are successful in the spring, they become fully matriculated. So that was one strategy of trying to grow the overall tuition revenue, seeing that the state support was relatively flat. At Wilmington University, and one of the things that attracted me to Wilmington after I was doing my research on them is they have what I considered a trend-setting kind of strategy going on, a lot of corporate partnership, where we have over, I would say, 30 to 50 corporate partners, where these partners have tuition benefit for their employees. So their employees would be taking courses at Wilmington, where primarily online, about 70%, 75% of our programs are online. So even pre-pandemic, we had the infrastructure in place to deliver academic modality online. So these partnership agreements, we're seeing a large growth in that area where employees of those corporations are taking courses, and those corporations are paying the university. So it's, in essence, almost can be seen as a debt-free kind of strategy and an employment retention for those corporations. At the same time, we are known, frankly, Wilmington was named for the second year in a row as one of the nation's most transfer-friendly institution by Phi Theta Kappa Honor Society, because we have a lot of articulation agreement with community colleges, some dual enrollment programs with high schools. So there was, frankly, I would say a little bit ahead of the curve pre-pandemic, start thinking about ways as a private institution in Delaware that's tuition driven, thinking about ways to not only go after the traditional high school students in terms of college going student, but looking at continuing adults, some professional development in terms of workforce development. So all in all, the revenue diversification was being thought of a little earlier than some other institution that I've seen.
Great, thanks. And how about Anne-Marie?
Hi, all. Well, much like Lloyd's institution, SUNY Adirondack really made significant investments in diversifying its revenue about 7 years before the pandemic. We very aggressively sought after and obtained grants that allowed tuition as a percentage of our total revenue to drop from about 50% down to about 41%, which we felt was really very significant as a college that values access. And we started many new programs that serve new populations, such as incarcerated students, international students, really invested in our dual enrollment college and the high school type programs, Con Ed and workforce development. And what I'll say that's a little different maybe than what Bronte and Lloyd have said so far is we are at a place where I'm advising my executive staff colleagues to consider contracting, that maybe we diversified our revenue too much. The data is showing that these areas that we invested in are not providing a return on that investment. And so we're kind of in a place where we're trying to weigh and analyze how much of that is because of the COVID disruption. Like we tried something, we kicked it off, and it was really disrupted by COVID. And so to kind of say it's not performing how we thought isn't fair at this point, versus which of those are just, we tried it and it's not working, so let's get out quickly before we invest too many resources and too much time. So that's pretty much where we are. The other thing I'll say is in New York State, sponsors bear, our sponsor county, the county that a community college is located in, bears a large share of the cost for a student. And it's different for each county. So it's a little unique to New York, although not totally unique. But that is also another area where I look at it as revenue diversification because it's not directly tied to student tuition, and it had started to fall behind a bit. And so about 3 years before COVID hit, we were able to work with the sponsor and show them the data that supported that their investment really hadn't kept pace with the cost of education and was resulting in the students having to bear more. So those conversations were put on hold for a little while, but I've picked back up again rather quickly and look very good. So from my perspective, that's also a little bit of a revenue diversification because it doesn't come directly from the student.
So sticking on the revenue diversification here, I have a kind of a follow-up question with this is, and I think Anne-Marie, you said something about, resources. You used the word resources in your response. With this diversification, have you had to see or manage your resources differently? Any of you, throughout the last several years?
Well, I'll say that anytime we have tried to invest in something new, it takes resources. So we have to dedicate resources, mostly personnel resources. That's the majority of what we are. Also, physical infrastructure resources for sure, including technology, to try to make that strategy successful. And for me, I feel like that's kind of the catch-22 place that we're at is, are these revenue diversification strategies successful, or do we try to contract and go back to the main mission of what we are? And I struggle with that also with something like a conference and event services. Ours not as successful as probably Bronte's. We tried it and realized it's a significant amount of time and resources for in the area in which I reside, not a lot of return revenue for that.
Steve, if I could jump in also on that question. What I've done both at the College of New Jersey and also here at Wilmington University is to partner revenue diversification with expense management or cost containment. Because as you know, higher ed or lion's share of the budget is personnel and some other costs. So we have to be judicious in terms of looking at the expense side and really kind of get into the habit of saying that expense management or cost containment is not a one-off thing. It has to be part of our DNA on an ongoing basis where we're looking at how can we better reallocate the limited resources we have. If a position becomes vacant, normally those positions get, I need to fill that position pretty much at the same salary like timeout. Let's make sure that refilling a position can be justified with our strategic priority. Because if we have a small set of key priorities that we're trying to advance the institution, those are what should take priority. So it's been kind of a challenge in higher ed, making tough choices are hard. And frankly, as part of our budget development process, starting to say, guys, if we want long-term financial sustainability, we have to always look for new revenue, but more importantly, what we have more control over is our costs. Let's try and use that. And for institutions who are highly leveraged in terms of debt, like TC and J is, but fortunately, Wilmington have practically no debt. I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. So it gives them the flexibility to do some things. If you're highly leveraged, you're in essence, a lot of your expenses are pretty much tied to, servicing the debt along with certain personnel unionized environments. So the cost containment, which, if, a lot of folks look at it as, laying off and so on and so forth. And that's not have to be the case. It has to be everything we're doing. Let's look for ways to do it more efficiently. There are some back office operation that could be better done. Some outsourcing possibility also exists in terms of efficiency and quality, because at the end of the day, it's the institutional long-term sustainability that we're trying to preserve.
And Steve, I would simply add to that. I'm sure many of us, when we came back to kind of a more normal operation, for those of us who have residential campuses, The first move was not to reinstate every expense the way it used to be. There, I think we learned some really critical lessons on both campuses, things that we used to think were must-haves during the period where we were looking for the greatest amount of efficiencies to manage, right, how we were responding to COVID. There created some real opportunities for us all to understand, well, maybe that wasn't a must-have, right? And so going into the next budget cycle, being able to repurpose those funds, reallocate those funds for newly defined priorities of the institution. And so I would say one of the greatest takeaways, I agree with Lloyd here, is the cost containment. And let's not return to business as it was. Are there efficiencies that we can operationalize on an ongoing basis so that we can repurpose those funds to harness other priorities as we go along? And Anne Marie, I couldn't agree with you more. Once we learn that something is not producing the results we want, we have to be willing to push pause, reevaluate, and determine new strategies. So lots of lessons learned as a result of how we all responded to the pandemic.
It's great. And I thank the three of you. So I think, as we talked about managing resources, as we look at the next slide, I want to ask, so what does recovery post-pandemic look like for your institutions, or, even if it's not for your institution, but for higher ed, as we think about some of the lessons learned? So Lloyd.
So for Wilmington, I would say is having enrollment back to pre-pandemic levels. Pre-pandemic, we had significant enrollment growth. In 2022, there was a slight dip in the overall enrollment, but fortunately, I'm here now and I see enrollment is going leaps and bounds above budget. So I would say pre-pandemic is where we can do strategic recruitment. We've been recruiting international students. It's paying off significantly. We have a large influx of international students, and those students pay a little premium compared to the domestic students, and they also are here in the States, so their modalities face-to-face. So I would say pre-pandemic is in terms of recovery, enrollment back to normal, but being judicious, as Bronte and Anne Maria says, about the cost side of your ledger, thinking that, okay, we need to manage the cost in such a way, because if the pandemic teaches us anything, is that you have to have enough reserves, liquid reserves, for unforeseen circumstances. So too often, let's say you have a couple $100 million in reserve, folks may look at it and say, oh, that's a lot of money. No, it's not. If it's not 2-3 times of your budget to give you a little bit of flexibility, that's not enough contingency or cushion. So I would say the thought of always looking to grow your reserve for those potential unforeseen circumstances, and also strategic investment at the same time. Access to capital. We're in an environment now where is inflation. If you want to issue new debt, the cost of capital is pretty high. So, making those kind of strategic decision is going to be very important. And I would say having the board of trustee really engage, because sometimes I've seen some board members they're like at the 30,000 level, which, they really don't understand, quote unquote, higher ed in the way I think they should. And one of the things that I've been fortunate to work with some boards that really understand the nuances of higher ed and the need for us to be very careful in terms of planning. Can't always rely on enrollment growth, can't rely on just discounting our tuition just to attract, because at the end of the day, you need to have those quote unquote operating margins in order to sustain the institution. So, but as back to your original question, we're an enrollment driven institution, just like on the cost side, we're a people driven institution. So we have to, once we manage those in a certain way, I think we'll be probably, if we can cover our operation if a next pandemic hit for a whole year without missing a beat, I would say that's a sign that, we're in good shape at that point.
Great. Anne Marie.
I'm chuckling a bit as Lloyd's talking about his reserves, because as a community college in New York State, we have about 1 month's operating expenses in reserve. I want to say that again, 1 month. And that's the average for the community colleges in our state. So we're in a very different place than you, Lloyd. But I would say recovery post-pandemic for my particular institution, a community college mid-size in New York, looks very empty. The parking lots are empty. Enrollment is the lowest that it's been in the last 20 years. The vaccine requirement in our state will only lift for fall of 23. So we still have a vaccine requirement. You can't attend SUNY Adirondack or any college in state operated or community college in New York if you're not vaccinated for COVID. And I had been planning when the pandemic hit I talked to people about like a 3-year recovery. Like, we're going to plan financially for a 3-year recovery. And I don't say that anymore. I don't think we're getting back to pre-pandemic levels of enrollment at any time, probably in the next decade in New York. So maybe 7 to 10 years is what I'm counting on and looking at. So I'll say, it's really nice to have students back on campus, but the campus feels very empty. It feels like it does during the summer when there aren't as many people there. And I think for us, that will be one of the challenges going forward is, community college is mostly an in-person type of experience. And with the push towards remote work, hybrid work, more online classes, still to be determined if they're as effective as in person or not for our population. But students clearly want them. What does that mean for the infrastructure, the in-person infrastructure that we have and the experience that students get when they actually come to campus? So, I think we're moving along, but our recovery certainly is not what I think the privates in our area are, for sure, where it's kind of felt like it's bounced right back and there's even maybe a nice wait list of students. We have plenty of seats if anyone wants to send them our way.
Great.
So Anne Marie, I'm kind of in the same boat as Lloyd, reserves. Because I would say for both institutions, both Dickinson and AU, although at different levels, rebuilding reserves is an important step of the recovery process, because at both institutions, having those reserves, especially when prior to knowing that there would be federal or state or other relief, having those reserves allowed us to be thoughtful in our initial response. Right, being able to immediately say to our faculty and staff, there will be no layoffs, there will be no job cuts. Let us figure where we're going, but having those reserves. So I know at AU, we spent a considerable amount of time during my first several months there, which is the recovery period, looking at our reserves and being very deliberate about the levels that we wanted to get those reserves for and the purposes that they would be used for going forward. At Dickinson and at AU, people often hear the CFO saying, I'm building reserves, if you can, Anne Marie, if you can. And they don't have an appreciation for the discipline that's required to build them. And then the criteria that might cause you to use them. So I would say for those institutions who may not have had many reserves, thinking about that as part of your budget discipline is important because it did allow us to be thoughtful. The other thing that we haven't touched on that I hope we all walk away from the pandemic experience understanding is the need for communication and transparency. I have a regular habit of having town halls to keep people apprised, but I would dare say that all three of us were talking with our community members so much more during that period. And I am continuing that because there are going to be no shortage of challenges waiting for us. And the degree to which we can keep the conversation open, whether we're seeing bustling with new students, Lloyd, or whether Anne Marie, we're challenged by them. I think the degree to which we can bring our communities along with us will help it that much easier as we have to make some of the tough decisions that may be down the road for all of us, right? I mean, I honestly think the degree to which our universities, campuses came together, college, community college, all of our institutions came together to solve this unknown was an unprecedented experience for all of us. But I hope what we take away is the need for that transparency and to bring the community along during the good recovery, bad times, all times, that we keep the line of communication open, because I think that was definitely the benefit of, or one of the tools to how all of us navigated that unprecedented time. So communication and transparency, I think, is a paramount takeaway from that experience.
Yeah, just to jump in there, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Frankly, I would be remiss if at TCNJ, one of the things we did was to create these public facing dashboards, financial dashboards, and put everything out there for the campus to see. Because if you're going through some tough times and you want folks to come along, you got to give them the information and you got to be as transparent as possible. So having those information out there in terms of the budget performance, the key performance indicator, levels of reserves, and to your point, Bronte, they're questioning the reserve, having your board of trustee endorse the reserve policy that serves as your guiding light, that it gives you more cachet, if you will, to say, I have to maintain a certain level of reserve because it's dictated in our board of trustee policy. So I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the transparency aspect of things, especially whether it's good times or bad time, but especially in the challenging times.
So great, thank you. I think that kind of transitions us to, so what we learned from the pandemic, and as we move to our next kind of topic about, thinking differently about budgets and resource allocations. And so I know that we have two questions that I'm going to pose to you in this kind of arena, or maybe three, but there's also going to be a question, and I'm preempting this with you all so that you know. There's a question that came in through the Q&A feature, and I do think that it might have some tie to the second question, which we'll talk about, the academic core. But I'm going to ask Anne Marie to kind of kick us off and let us know, as a CFO, what challenges do you see institutions facing? So as we look at the slide, the next slide.
Sure. So I picked three that I felt were important, not just for, medium-sized community college in our state, but probably across the board for all of us. And the first one for me really is that it feels as though higher ed's model is inherently in danger right now. The value of an education is questioned regularly by politicians, by employers who are willing to hire at the same salary without the education. And so kind of emphasizing that value and convincing people of it feels like one of the challenges at a community college. We're focused on equitable access and outcomes, really trying to establish like a wage waterline and transfer goals for our programs. If students aren't going to make a certain amount of money when they graduate or be able to transfer into a certain institution, then do we really want to continue that program or invest in it? Creating and enhancing really strong structures for analyzing results and kind of modifying our approaches if needed, like we've talked about already today, right? Like if it's not working, make a modification instead of just continuing to move on. And really recognizing the value of experiences and supports outside of the classroom. Our faculty are so valuable. They are the heart and soul of our institutions, and yet our students today are demanding far more than just the in-classroom experience. And so, encouraging the entire campus community to understand that demand from our students and respond to it while still showing our faculty that they are the most important thing on our campus, right? And that we value them deeply, but still making funds available for those other things. The number 2 thing I had, which we've talked about a little bit today, is creating a long-term financial plan. I will tell this group, when COVID hit, I was on 3-month FMLA leave. I had just had a baby 2 days before. And I was not worried at all about my institution, about my team. We had a plan that I felt at the time was fluid enough to be able to guide them, not just a long-term financial plan, but an emergency management plan through that 3-month period. And really talking in advance. We've talked a lot today about communication, right, with the college community. Fortunately, when you're a pretty small college, everything is very transparent. There's really nothing to hide. There's no money hidden anywhere. Everyone knows where every single dollar is. And so it's a little easier, I think, to make sure that the campus community in general is included in conversations very regularly, fully understands the impact of your resource allocations, really kind of talking about tuition planning, which is far more important at the privates with the discounting than it is for us, but being able to kind of run through those scenarios of what do different tuition and fee metrics look like compared to the aid that students are able to get, and what gap do they have. And really, I think the third thing I picked for me was the future of work. I think it is becoming very, very challenging to recruit and retain talent to work in higher education. It is a very stressful environment to be in right now, especially if you're at an institution that kind of punches higher than its weight and doesn't have a big operating budget to begin with. It's asking a lot. It's a lot of people. And so really establishing and fostering a common sense of purpose and community amongst your employees, finding ways to engage them and keep them engaged and show them how valuable they are, and adapt to this new culture of hybrid remote work. When people say, well, I did it for a year at home and nothing happened, nothing fell through the cracks. It's hard to argue with that. And yet we are mostly an in-person environment, right? There are very few of us who work at institutions that are, 100% remote, and that's our thing, and that's what we do. So I really think the future of work will be a challenge for many of us. And it's not just about hybrid remote. It's really about today's employee and what they want out of their career and how long they'll stay with you. Because 3 years is not a long time in higher ed, but 3 years is about the average of where, the length of service that today's employees will give you. So that really leaves a large gap of knowledge for an industry that really is very specialized when you think about it. So those were the 3 I picked.
Great, thanks. Bronte.
I'm going to piggyback on a little of what Anne Marie said there. My focus was on technology and people, because I think technology, that's going to remain a significant investment for us if we are going to be competitive in the landscape. So true enough, most of us were able to pivot during COVID and move to high flex course delivery. But going forward, there are some expectations about our ability to maintain that, right? There are growing data and network management considerations. Cybersecurity. Are we able to protect the academic and health information of our students? Well, for that matter, our faculty, staff, and students, right? Are we able to protect that, the data and the networks themselves? Additionally, I think we're all trying to figure out the impact of AI, artificial intelligence, right? There will be some immediate opportunities potentially to backfill our back office operations with some of these technologies. And then there are some potential threats on the academic side of of our institution. So the future of AI and being able to kind of keep our finger on the pulse there. This question of hybrid work environments. Yes, our employees are coming to us wanting more and more flexibility. And what does that mean? What does that mean when our buildings are primarily vacant? And or you start to have employees who are not in the same state and they're covering multiple states. What does that mean for the sense of community? And then there are questions around, well, which jobs are student facing and require a certain amount of time on campus and which don't? And then there are equity questions around that. I mean, so the hybrid work environment brings its own set of challenges for us. But given the demographic cliff that we're also facing for 2025, especially those of us on the East Coast here, what does that mean in terms of recruiting and retaining students, right? And so people, whether they be our faculty and staff that we're trying to recruit and retain on our campuses, or the students, and the notion that there's simply going to be fewer 18 to 22-year-olds, and then the demographic composition of who those students are, that will require some changes on our part in terms of how we recruit them, and then the programming necessary to retain them, not to mention the additional challenges that some of our students are bringing to our campuses in terms of mental health and well-being. So I say people and technology are the things that we should all keep our fingers on the pulse of, because I think they're inherent in both of those are some real challenges as we look to the coming years.
Great, Lloyd.
So Bronte and Anne Marie really covered a couple of the things I had in mind, but the one thing I'll kind of add to the discussion here is deferred maintenance liability. That's that unhidden liability that will come up and bite you when a pipe underground breaks or whatever the case may be. And I don't want to call TC&J out, but we have they had, because not we anymore, a pretty significant deferred liability problem. And if you're highly leveraged, then you are somewhat limited in your ability to access the capital market to really do some of those major capital projects. Fortunately, at Wilmington here, as I said, we are about 75% online. The facilities are in pretty good shape. And frankly, we're looking to do some serious expansion. I would be remiss if I didn't announce that we're starting a new law school in the fall. And as part of that new law school, there's a new building. So I have to come up with the financing structure for that new building, plus a convocation center. So institutions of different size and scope are going to have different challenges. So, the deferred maintenance is most institutions, especially if you have older buildings, it requires a lot. Bronte mentioned technology. I also see that as a challenge and also an opportunity at the same time. As I said, we're predominantly online, so we have to make sure we're staying abreast of the latest technology. What the pandemic does is it's kind of forces most institutions to kind of ramp up their technology infrastructure. So, at one point, Wilmington was like, yeah, we're in the catbird seat. We have all this technology, not a lot of competition, but now everyone is looking for that kind of flexibility in terms of academic delivery and also hybrid working. So yeah, cybersecurity, all that stuff is something that we got to pay close attention to.
Great, thank you all. So I'm going to switch to the next question. And the premise of this question is, your institution and the delivery of the academic core. As you think about what we're all about is academics and imparting knowledge. And so did your institution change the delivery of the academic core? And, as you're thinking about this question, and I know you have some notes, one of the questions that came in was around the reducing of academic programs. And so when you were talking earlier about cost containment sites, one of the questions is, did any of you have experience reducing academic program offerings in response to the enrollment pressures. And so as we think about, the delivery of the academic core, we look at enrollment, how has that changed?
Hey, Steve, I would say both at AU and at Dickinson, there was no primary change to the delivery of the academic core. At American, I will point out that a very large percentage of our students study abroad. So we did experiment with a small cohort of courses, making those available online so that if our students traveled abroad, they can keep pace with their academic program, but it was a very modest number of courses and nothing that I would say is wholesale. I think there probably are institutions who did make changes there, but in terms of how we're thinking about our courses going forward, the role of program review, because as we think about the shifting demographics, Gen Z, one of the things that the Academy is not known for is our nimbleness and our flexibility. I think we got a crash course in that during COVID in our response, and I'm hoping we stick with it, right? Because I think with some of the competition that we're all facing, we all will need to do a review of the relevancy of the totality of our course offerings. Right? What makes sense before may not make sense going forward. And I do know of a number of institutions who had to make those kinds of decisions and or are in the process of doing that going forward. So I think if institutions don't have a robust program review process, this is the time to kind of begin working on that, because I think the years ahead have some challenges for all of us.
So for what I've done at the College of New Jersey, because whenever it talks about academic and looking at productivity, the faculty kind of get a little scared. So partnering with the provost, VP for Academic Affairs, was critical. We really didn't look to, quote unquote, sunset any program, but what we've done is brought in a firm to do a comprehensive administrative and academic program review to look at, work, and we involve a lot of the deans, some faculty members. Just to be candid, it was in the middle of COVID, and we say, guys, we got to look at these programs. There are some programs that are under enroll with tenure track lines in those programs. How do you kind of, balance that kind of dilemma? So, it was a pretty comprehensive report that the faculty and the deans all had a look at, and I know that they had planned on taking some action around that particular report. Here at Wilmington, no change in really the academic core. As I said, we have the online infrastructure, so there's really no need. But as I said, there's always looking for ways to improve it, always doing student surveys and so on and so forth, because frankly, a lot of institutions are now moving into that particular line of academic delivery. So we have to make sure we are either keeping a pace or ahead of our competitors in order to attract the kind of students we want.
Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll say at my institution, probably much like Lloyd and Bronte's, the delivery of the academic core has not changed significantly. We had seen a decline in enrollment pre-COVID and had eliminated about 2 programs at our institution, which is probably the first time that had been done in a very, very long time. It was a very painful process, even though they were really probably less than 10 people enrolled in each program. But just for the, the culture of our institution itself, that was a very painful process. What we have seen is an increase in online or hybrid type courses versus 100% in person. And we probably didn't offer enough of those based on what the students really wanted. But we're also really not sure yet what the outcomes are for those courses. especially as it relates to various different populations. But students are, we find, kind of demanding that level of flexibility. And as a community college with students that, many of which are not enrolled full-time, they're not residential, they have lives, they have jobs, they have children. We have to find a way to meet them where they are at and bring the education to them. So I would say, we're kind of on the precipice of figuring that out, but we're not there yet for sure. But it did kind of bring that forward through COVID. Just like remote work, right? You're never going to go 100% back. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to pull back to offering almost no online courses. We're going to have to find what that sweet spot is and make sure that we're delivering the same education to those students.
That's great. This has been even insightful for me, even though we've had conversations before about this program and listening to the three of you this afternoon. So, as we think about our resources and, as we think of the next slide and the question posed, because there's a little bit of substance here. What does resource management look like? We've talked about this in, throughout the program so far, but what does resource management look like as it pertains to some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that you all talked about? So as you think about the human capital challenges, the spaces and places kind of in that hybrid, you've all talked about the hybrid modality, safety and security. And I think that something that we think and hear about more and more is about the student mental health and the different resource management that institutions are coming to. So Floyd, why don't you kick us off and talk about the management and how it looks to you?
Sure. So both Anne-Marie and Bronte had alluded to this in terms of the hybrid work modality. As a matter of fact, a couple of months ago, what was it? This great migration in terms of higher ed. It's very hard to really attract and retain talent. So one way to do so is to provide flexibility. And here at Wilmington University, all the VP has complete discretion in terms of their division, in terms of the work modality, work from home, some days, come in some days. The flexibility is unreal, in my opinion, and the employees love that. And frankly, we find that the productivity is even higher when you give folks that level of flexibility. So we are still maintaining our flexibility similar to when it was during the pandemic, allowing folks to work remotely on the days they wish based on operational needs. In terms of the space, the space program, spacing, as Anne-Marie had alluded to, a lot of the facility or buildings going to go unoccupied. So we look to do like a space needs assessment. Can we monetize some of our assets in terms of, do we need this particular building, and can we sell a particular building and then bring folks over more to the central campus? So we're in the process of doing that kind of assessment. One of the things they did before I got here, you saw me using this headphone. There's no desktop phone anywhere at the university. We migrate to Teams. There was a significant cost savings. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're on your desktop, you have one of these headphones, all your calls are routed through Teams. So it's connected to my cell phone. So it's really one of those efficiency play. And you kind of, okay, you don't have to be, I'm working from home, but my phone is ringing on my desk and I can't access it. So those are some of the kind of initiative that was implemented just before I got here that I thought was excellent. Safety and security, we're in my little thing here. That's the number one priority. To access any buildings, you got to scan in. So safety, security, that's a top priority of ours, especially IT related security. I mentioned that we're predominantly online. So we, cyber security, making sure the latest infrastructure. We do a lot of our what we call like penetration testing of our system for hacking and so on and so forth. So all in all, I think it's really a different mindset. There's a significant level of investment that's required to upkeep and protect safety and security, and also student mental health. We have to, you know, doing some kind of reorganization to really invest not only in mental health, but all other student services. How do we deliver, we're predominantly online. How do we make students feel like we can be reached whenever and we're being responsive? So reorganizing some of our operation and giving the students almost, I don't want to say 24/7 access, but the access to addressing issues are phenomenal when it comes to students reaching out with issues. So I think all in all, we're thinking about the future in a different manner. In terms of making sure flexibility is always provided as long as the work is getting done.
Anne Marie.
Well, I'll try not to spend too much time on the things we've talked about quite a bit so far. But I think we all have to talk about human capital challenges, right? So, community college, we struggle to pay people fairly for their work. And especially now when positions become vacant, we never just fill one, we always look, but the reality is we're under-resourced to begin with. So many times we need to fill that position, and you're filling it. To fill it, you're paying a wage that's higher than the individual who possibly has worked on your campus for a very long time. And so, we have that kind of compression going on, and currently we're working to do a compensation study to help realign that. But the question then becomes, how do you pay for the results of the compensation study? It is the resource management challenge, I believe. Personnel and benefits are 80% of our budget. It really is for us the resource management challenge. We self-insured our health insurance several years ago. We are fully self-insured. We made significant savings by doing that. We did it over a long period of time, where we instituted a wellness program for our employees. Like, we did it step by step to try to make sure that our employees were healthy, that we had a healthy culture, and then took that risk on ourselves. And we also think that helps make us a better employer when our team members, our staff, our employees know that we care about their health, and that they are important to us. Safety and security, I will say, I have seen in my decade, well, I've been at Adirondack on and off for about 15 years. It has transformed from an outsourced night security guard, one person that came at 9 o'clock at night when classes ended and stayed until 8 the next morning when we opened, to a 24/7, 365 force of campus peace officers. They are not police officers, they're peace officers, they are armed. And that is a major transition to make over the course of a decade, with significant financial investment on the size of a campus that would struggle with that kind of financial investment, right? So where does that money come from? It has to pull from somewhere. You can invest in anything, but you have to stop doing something else when your resources are limited to what's in front of you for the year. We're not really allowed to take on debt. We didn't mention that before, but I want to. So community colleges in New York State are not allowed to hold debt. I am so thankful for that, because I think there is a large temptation to invest resources that you don't have to attract students. And if you are financially in a good place and you have the bond rating to do so, you can leverage that investment. You can take out debt, and then you could get stuck with the debt repayment payments going forward. And I think we see the small colleges that close many times, it's because they've come up with a debt payment that they can't make. And so I'm very grateful that we're not allowed to do that. And yet it does restrict us to solely being able to spend the resources that we have right in front of us at that point in time. But safety and security, people are demanding. There's a culture in K through 12 that simply we have not had in higher education on our wide open campuses. As a community college, we are open to the public. Our library is open to anyone that wants to walk in. And it is a very different environment for students and their parents to adjust to when they leave high school and they enter college. And student mental health is somewhat the same in that we've never really had clinical mental health services on our campus, but that is now the expectation, especially after COVID. And that is the investment, the resource investment that we will have to make, is to figure out how to provide those clinical mental health services on our campus to our students. They are not readily available in our area off campus. And so partnering is not really a viable option for us. And so that is another one of the resource management investments we're just going to have to figure out how to make. But that means we'll have to stop doing something else that we've been doing.
So Steve, I guess that leads me to clean up with the final responses to this one. From the human capital standpoint, one of the things that we haven't covered is the need to review our benefits offerings. That's one of the conversations we're currently having, because in a world that is more flexible with the hybrid work environment, there are questions about whether the traditional benefits bundle is still appropriate going forward. So we're about to do a comprehensive review of our benefits and to have questions about, is this still appropriate going forward? Because we're starting to get questions about loan forgiveness, for example, more time off versus additional compensation, especially in a hybrid work environment. And so just taking a look at all the things that are traditional for us and whether those are appropriate going forward. So just throw that one out there. With regard to space and place, we have actually staffed a space management and planning office for the first time on our campus. We began about a year and a half ago with a space planning and management committee. I chair that because space is a resource and has representatives from across the university, but daring to develop actual protocols for how we will think about space going forward. Lloyd and Anne Marie, as daring as it seems, defining some of these things, right? One of the things that are in our protocols says that every employee is guaranteed a workspace. I want you to listen to that language. It doesn't say an office. It doesn't say an individual office. So starting to look at, based on responsibilities and job title and responsibilities, who really should have an office and who doesn't. Depending on the number of days of the week that you come in, if you're here less than X number of weeks, Lloyd, you might qualify for an office, but because you're here under that threshold, you and Anne Marie are sharing an office, right? And what that is allowing us to do, and we're using the building that I am in, which is one of our commercial buildings, so that we can consolidate a very large portion of our staff. Lloyd, I'm going to clear an entire floor and monetize that space because our brokers say that there's great interest in this particular building, okay? Additionally, I'm freeing up space in an academic building that allows us to repurpose that space. So space is a big one for us, and even standing up a space management office so that we can do this in a comprehensive manner, doing a full space audit across the university. No more anecdotes, actual data to drive how we think about space and place going forward. And both of you know that space is as personal as compensation. So continue to keep me lifted in prayer, okay? As we think about safety and security, it makes a difference being here in the District of Columbia. One of our institutions here just announced 2 days ago that they will arm their police force, which is something that's new for them. We're having those conversations, or about to revisit that question on our campus. Don't know that we will change our position, but because of the prevalence of active shooter incidents, Anne Marie, to your question or your point, there are lots of questions around these topics and how we think about safety and security. So revisiting that conversation, again, don't know that I expect us to change course, but it's appropriate to revisit the question from time to time. And what does that mean on our campuses? And we've talked about student mental health, but the increased number of accommodations that our students are coming to our campuses with really has required an additional investment. And so I don't think we will see that changing over time. So it is important for us to think about the services and programs that we will sunset, right, to free up the resources to meet the changing needs of our population. So lots for us all to be thinking about.
That's great. So as we move into our kind of our third section of where do we go from here, I just want to remind folks to use the Q&A function if you have questions to ask our panelists today. But we're going to start with, where do we go from here? And I'm going to lead off. And I know that we used the same kind of topic a couple of years back. And I think it's something that we ask not only CFOs, but we see this with presidents. But what would you say we are the top kind of categories and financial stressors as we look at the slide? So I'll start with Anne Marie as we move to the next slide.
Sure. Yeah. I gave this a significant amount of thought, this question. We've talked about many of them today already, right? Because those are the ones that keep us up at night. I'm going to say for me, the top financial stressor is inflation. Inflation everywhere. So as it relates also to tuition revenue. As a community college, we want to be accessible. It is very difficult for me to propose a tuition increase greater than 3%. State funding in New York State has actually declined over the last decade to community colleges. Over the last 3 years, it's been flat. From our sponsors, we've been given a 2% increase, and we've been asking during COVID, we asked students for no increase in tuition, and then proposed 3% after that. Compare that to the increase in salaries that our employees expect, the cost of benefits, health insurance, retirement plans, the increased costs in technology themselves, both software and hardware, along with services, and many of our third-party contracts that we have. So many of those things that used to derive some revenue now are a cost, or those costs have increased. Our financial picture, as in a community college in New York State, it's probably a little more basic than the privates. I know it is, because I managed one of those for a while as well. Your revenue equals your expense. And when your employees are demanding salary increases at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8%, and your revenues not only not increasing at the same rate, but the volume is dropping, this formula does not work. It doesn't work. And so for me, as the president of my association of New York State business officers, I believe this is our top financial stressor. It's inflation.
Great. Bronte.
For us, I would say it's keeping our finger on the pulse of what's required in terms of student enrollment going forward. Being on the East Coast, the reality that there will be so fewer 18 to 22-year-olds. We heavily, I mean, we're all over the country and recruit internationally as well, but the primary base of our students come from this Eastern Seaboard. And so what does that mean for us as we go forward? And it's not enough to recruit the class, which we have historically not had a problem doing, but retaining our students as we go forward and making sure that we are understanding what their needs are, what are the factors that lead to them transferring to other institutions, what changes do we need to make both on the undergraduate and graduate side, because we're not just a undergraduate institution. We've talked before about relevancy. We're very hesitant in the academy to look at our academic offerings. But Anne-Marie, to your point earlier, we add, but very seldom do we subtract, right? And so having those conversations about how do we critically examine everything that we do, right, for value add as we go forward. So wanting us to be competitive in the people space. And so there I'm talking about not just our students, but also in terms of attracting talent on our faculty and staff. So people are at the top of my list, making sure that we're growing the aid that we will need to be sure that access and affordability are things that we continue to demonstrate are priorities for us, but also being able to ensure that our students are having the most high quality experience in the form of the faculty and staff that we're able to recruit and retain to the institution. So people are at the top of my list of priorities, both in the form of our faculty, staff, and students.
So for Wilmington, in our mission explicitly is to be the provide affordable, high quality education. So the board, the president, everyone is like, look, tuition and fee is going to be very nominal, regardless of where inflation or the higher ed price index is. So similar to Anne-Marie, we're in inflationary times. There are significant demand for institutional scholarship, and at the same time, there's constraint on the level of increase for tuition and fees. So for me, the concept of the revenue diversification, those strategic partnerships that I spoke about, to me, that it's a stressor and it's an opportunity at the same time, because I need to grow the pie, if you will, to keep the overall cost of attendance really affordable. And at the same time, saying to the campus community, we got to continue these expense management. And they're looking at me like, wait a minute, we have a record year in enrollment growth. You have the revenue for us to do what we need to do. So I'm like, you have to look at it in a holistic fashion. We do have influx in revenue, but at the same time, we got to keep tuition and fee low. We got to give out more scholarship, and we want to make some strategic investments. So it's kind of a combination of things with, at the end of the day, is how do we make sure the affordability is being preserved for our students at the high quality level of education that we're known to provide.
So as a follow-up to that, to the response on the stressors, I guess if you have any thoughts on how are you planning for risk mitigation, you know, as we think about the financial stressors and the risks. So what are some thoughts on risk mitigation from your perspective?
Steve, that's a really good question. We just took the leadership across the university through a risk perception survey to include the board down to director levels across the university. And then we compared our data with that of a number of organizations, United Educators, NACUBO. There are a number of entities that look at risk across our sector. And the next step for us at AU is to engage the community in the findings from that survey in developing. We've outlined the top 10 so that we can work together on the mitigation strategies. Nothing that showed up on our list was a surprise, but it was a healthy exercise to actually be able to see how the board is viewing risk compared to how the cabinet is reviewing risk compared to other entities, and then to talk across lines about what does this mean for us going forward. I think one of the lessons learned coming out of COVID is to keep the lines of communication open about the challenges that we're facing and to resist the temptation to go back into our silos. So we're having a university-wide discussion about those factors that we think place us at greatest risk. And it's not a one and done conversation. It is intended to be an ongoing conversation where we engage all of the appropriate constituent groups.
Yeah, and I agree. That's a great question. At the College of New Jersey, I co-led with our general counsel enterprise-wide risk assessment, where we bring in a firm from an outside to do a deep dive assessment, identify the top 15 to 25 risks that on an annual basis, each VP has to go in and do that and that deep dive analysis in terms of the risk profile, how we would mitigate those risks, which is reputational, financial, you name it. We kind of cover the gamut of the various risks, and at the same time report to the board on a regular basis as far as, okay, here's the risk profile, how are we going to mitigate it? So I've been having similar conversation here at Wilmington in terms of our, doing kind of an enterprise-wide risk assessment. The one thing that I'm going to make sure I take it to the next level is doing this risk assessment is great, but having a tool that you can model the financial implication to those potential risks will kind of bring it home, because a lot of times we talk about risk in terms of deferred maintenance or reputation and so forth, but the quantification of those risks is what I think going to bring home to this senior leadership and the board to say, hey, we got to be very attentive to the top 5 or 10 risks that gets identified and gets tracked over the coming years.
I don't have much to add because Lloyd and Bronte really covered it all, but I will just, I do want to stress that importance of enterprise risk management, and just to say that, if you're on this call and you don't already fully engage in an ongoing process of enterprise risk management to start, and it can become so overwhelming to think about, you can start very small. So start small, even if you're in your own area, and just say, what are the 1 or 2 things, if we step back and we really take a look at what would be the largest risks to the successful operation and successful completion of our mission in our institution, in our area, in our department, and try to develop some risk mitigation strategies for that. So it's very easy to become totally overwhelmed by enterprise risk management. You can start small if that's where you're at, but the important thing is to do something with it.
Great, thanks. So we're going to pause here and see if there are any last minute questions, and I would encourage you to use, as shown on the next slide, the Zoom webinar Q&A feature. And I will pause here for 1 moment. And if no additional questions, because we've answered the questions that have come in thus far, if none come in, we will then ask our panelists to share some final thoughts on the topic today. It doesn't look like anything has come in. So let's talk some final thoughts. So I'm going to ask I think we started with Bronte. We're going to end with Bronte kicking us off here. If we can move to the next slide. And Bronte, some final thoughts for our listeners today.
Yeah, communication. I would say, as a CFO, I've long thought that gone are the days that we get to sit in the office with a 10-key calculator and some spreadsheets, right? It is absolutely imperative that we're constantly scanning the environment and engaging with our colleagues across the university. As we saw with the pandemic and COVID, I mean, unprecedented times that required us to pivot on a dime. And as a sector, we did things that I think we thought were previously impossible. Unfortunately, I think some of the headwinds that are out there in front of us are going to pose some long-standing challenges for us. And it's going to be imperative that we are staying engaged with all of our key stakeholder groups. I know on my campus, I rely on my gift of communication as much as I do my financial acumen. I am meeting regularly with the faculty senate leadership, the staff council leadership. I have a thing called Brunch with Bronte, where I will answer whatever questions you have, but you got to get them to me in advance, engaging with our students. We can't afford to be the administrator that no one knows. I want you to know how I think, how I come to decision-making, the role that data plays in the recommendations that I bring forward. So I would just encourage all of us that are on the call here to keep the lines of communication open on your respective campuses, because there are real challenges lurking out there for us, and we're going to be best equipped to handle them if we are working together.
Lloyd.
Okay, so I would say fiscal resiliency got to be our focus. Steve, at the opening, you alluded to the commission, and I serve on the commission, so I've actually seen it firsthand. How the pandemic has exposed the long-standing vulnerability of some higher education. So if we're not serious about fiscal resiliency, institution having really a clear plan that is endorsed by the board, the president, all the senior leadership, it's going to be challenging. Frankly, higher ed some higher ed institutions have been in trouble pre-pandemic. I actually read an article. It was the Trends in Higher Ed 2018 Outlook, written by Robert Urshan from Alvarez and Marceau. And in this article, there were some really thought-provoking questions laid out for higher ed institution on the financial side, on the academic side, and also on the operational side. So I'll leave the audience with this one question that he asked. He titled it under this concept of a change readiness test. And I'm thinking as an institution, if we're able to really address that particular question, we could do a long way in kind of getting to that fiscal resiliency and long-term financial sustainability. So the question he poses, are the institution and its leadership teams realistically positioned to take decisive actions to create change and embrace economic models that are financially sustainable? This is pre-COVID. This question was raised. And so I would advise folks read the article. I've actually used snippets of it at presentation when I was at the college in New Jersey doing some budget presentation, because I think there were a lot of thought-provoking questions that as senior leadership CFOs, if we are serious about long-term fiscal sustainability, let's take it to heart and kind of build our plan and our conversation around some of those questions and socialize it with board of trustee, with the campus community, so we can kind of all get on the same wavelength.
Anne-Marie.
Well, I think Bronte and Lloyd really hit on the two things that I was going to say were important to me: communication, long-term financial planning, fiscal resiliency. So I think what I want to do is just say thank you to everyone that attended and let you know that I saw the registration list. There were many individuals signed up to attend that are not in financial management roles at your institution. And so I want to say that I appreciate your interest. Each of you is valued, and the work that we do is so important to our students and our communities. So I'm not known for sugarcoating things. I just kind of say it like it is. As a financial management person, it can feel a little lonely on a college campus in higher education, right? We're usually delivering the bad news. Someone gave me a no button once as a holiday gift. They thought it was funny. It's funny, but I don't like to say no. Like, I like to say yes. So it can feel a little lonely, maybe like we're swimming in a different direction sometimes, but our expertise and our feedback is very valuable to the institutions and the students that we serve. So please just keep doing the good work that you're doing.
That's great. Those are some great final thoughts. And Lloyd, I have to ask you to come back on mic here. And if you could, we're getting lots of requests for the name of that article. And then we
The
will
name of the
also try to
article?
get it to you
I
as
had
well.
it somewhere here. It's the Trends in Higher Education 2018 Outlook. And it was written by Robert Hersan, Hersan, from Alvarez and Marsal. You can Google it on the website. Frankly, I think another entity had actually, quote unquote, do a paraphrasing just to reissue the article, because there are some questions there, maybe a dozen or 15 to or so questions that are very pertinent. They're not all applicable to all higher education institutions, but I think you can find a half a dozen of those questions that shared with your board, shared with your president, and start having those kind of discussion on your campuses.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Bronte, Lloyd, and Anne Marie for spending the last hour and 22 minutes talking and imparting knowledge about the post-pandemic and where we're going from here in the aftermath. And so thank you for your commitment to higher education, and thank you for on behalf of the commission for taking time today out of your busy schedules to be with us. And so as we wrap up, we are excited to provide our membership with a variety of events throughout the year. And as we see through our slides and our presentations, this year we saw a return to our in-person annual conference, which featured plenary speakers, concurrent sessions. And I'm going to put a plug in here right now for those of you that are listening. We are still accepting call for proposals for our annual conference for the 2023, which will be held December 4th through the 6th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania again. And then in addition to our annual conference, the commission is continuing to provide webinars throughout the spring semester. And I encourage you all to look at our events page as well. And so on behalf of the commission and on behalf of higher education, I thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at other events. So have a great rest of the day.